What are we discussing on today's Locked On Diamondbacks podcast? The Fringe roster guys who have the most to prove this spring training, and stats, good or bad, the D-backs won't replicate from 2024.
You are Locked On Diamondbacks, your daily Arizona Diamondbacks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into the Locked On Diamondbacks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. You're listening to who? The always charismatic host of this podcast, Millard Thomas, multimedia journalist and a graphic designer. So please go check out my website, millardthomas24.myportfolio.com. On there you can see all my latest work, from my packages to my articles to my photos and my graphic design. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Download the app or head to FanDuel.com to get started. On today's Locked On Diamondbacks podcast, we're going to discuss the Fringe roster guys who are fighting for their opening day roster spot, who have the most to prove this spring training. And then let's take a look at some stats from 2024. The stats that the D-backs won't be replicating, good or bad, this upcoming season, and what they have to do to either replace those numbers or improve those numbers. So a whole bunch I want to talk to you guys about on today's podcast. Thank you for making Locked On Diamondbacks your first listen every day. I would not be able to do this podcast without you, my loyal listeners, sharing, subscribing, reviewing, doing all that so I could do this podcast for you. Thank you. It's free. It's available on all platforms. So please continue to tell your friends. One of those platforms is YouTube. Please hit subscribe to Locked On Diamondbacks on YouTube. All right, let's get into the Locked On Diamondbacks podcast, and let's discuss some Fringe roster guys who have a lot to prove this spring training, who are looking to make the D-backs opening day roster. I'm going to start off with a pretty fun name in Drey, Jameson, who of course missed like all of last season, right? Due to injury, getting Tommy John, but this is someone that we were really excited about prior to his injury. 1.48 ERA that first season, 3.32 ERA right before he got hurt. We know this guy has a pretty lively fastball. He's oozing talent whenever he's been on the mound. 95 with the sinker, 95 with the four-seamer. He's flashed a whole bunch of talent. This is someone that we've wanted to turn into a starter in the past. I don't think right now, considering we have 7 guys that are already made for the rotation, there's just not a path for Drey Jameson to be a starter right now for the D-backs unless half the guys get hurt. But where there is a path for is for Drey Jameson to be a nasty back-end reliever for the D-backs. He could definitely fit into like that number 4, number 5 slot. Like you look at Martinez, Puck, Ginkles, your solidified top 3, and then you can make an argument. Yes, Ryan Thompson's in that argument as probably better, so is Joe Mantiply. But in terms of talent, yeah, Drey Jameson is probably better than them. It's just about consistency and all that fun stuff. And so Drey Jameson, coming off the injury, missed all of 2024. I think he has a lot to prove this spring training to remind folks how good he was prior to the injury, how talented he is, that the stuff by Drey Jameson is really good. So I think he has a lot to prove this offseason because a good spring training by Drey Jameson, he could earn himself a role in the bullpen because I think the D-backs, of course, loaded in the rotation, still have a couple holes in the back end of the bullpen. There's still a spot or two that's still open right now. And so Drey Jameson has a lot to prove this offseason if he can go back to looking like that guy prior to the injury, because he still might be the best overall athlete the D-backs have. Crazy to say considering he's a pitcher, but go ask Corbin Carroll who's faster in a foot race between Drey and himself. You might be surprised by the answer. Seth Martinez, someone that was acquired, I think via the waiver wire this offseason, played for the Astros last season, 3.59 ERA and 52 innings pitched with the Astros last year. So the traditional stats look pretty good with Seth. The thing is, he's not a big strikeout guy, only 6.2 strikeouts per 9 last season. He was around 9 his 3 seasons prior, so you would like for him to get back to those numbers if possible, but this is a guy that has always struggled with his command a little bit, a lot of walks throughout his career, a good amount of contact allowed as well. Seth Martinez is one of those guys. The ERA looks fine, but the underlying numbers, you want a little bit more. And he's not a guy that throws hard. He tops out around, his average fastball is around 91 miles per hour. Like, this is not a guy that throws very hard. If you could really come in and be like a ground ball pitcher that pitches to contact like a Ryan Thompson, but is effective like Ryan Thompson, then yes, I could see him as one of the last spots in the bullpen. But that's why he has a lot to prove this offseason, because despite the ERA being good 2 of the last 3 regular seasons, the advanced stats would probably tell you he's not as good as what that ERA suggests. He doesn't strike out people. He's not afraid to give up walks, and he gives up a good amount of contact as well. Maybe it's fool's gold with Seth Martinez. That's why he should have a little bit of a chip on his shoulder this spring training, as the D-backs still need more good relievers for that bullpen. Same with this next guy who we saw pitch with the D-backs last year, who is like, I would have to check the MLB.com top 30 prospects again, but I believe he's a top 10 prospect for the D-backs right now. Yolber Diaz, who made a few starts last year, 4 starts with the injuries in the rotation. Yolber needed to step up, and he looked fine. A 3.81 ERA over 28 innings pitched. Was he amazing? No, he still gave up some walks, still gave up some hits. The strikeout ability wasn't exactly, striking, but he did flash his potential. He showed you why this guy is considered a top 10 prospect in the system. Despite the system, not being the best right now by D-back standards, he's still a guy with a upper 90s fastball sitting at 96 with a little slider, knuckle curve action. Yolber Diaz, again, doesn't have a path really to the rotation right now like a Drey Jameson. But if you're talking about a guy that could throw hard as your last or second to last spot in the bullpen, also a guy that could be a potential spot starter for you if more guys get hurt like last year in the rotation. If something like that with the rotation apocalypse happens again, Yolber Diaz could be a perfect guy to slide in and get you a couple spot starts. So I really like Yolber Diaz. I like the fact that he's young, only 24 years of age. He can throw hard. I like guys that could convince myself, hey, right situation, right scenario, the potential, the talent's there. Maybe something can happen for him if he puts it all together. I would rather go in that direction than probably an older guy like Seth Martinez, who's like 30 years old. But we'll see what happens with the D-backs, with how these guys, are evaluated in spring training. Because one final guy I want to talk about before we get to segment number 2 and get to part 2 of some of these guys I want to discuss today, a guy who I didn't mention yesterday on that battle for Kevin Newman, but a guy who's certainly in the mix, Tim Tawa. He can play a little infield, a little outfield. Tim Tawa had a very good season with the Reno Aces last year. Between AA and AAA, he had a 279 average, a 868 OPS, plus 30 home runs, displayed monster power potential last year. He's 6 foot. He's a pretty big guy that could play all over the field defensively. That power is true. The D-backs can still use a backup infielder and one that could play some outfield defense as well. Is just a plus if that power is legit from what we saw from Tim last year, because the year prior in 2023 also had a 22 home run season. Now we know the minor leagues for the D-backs, the stats are a little bit inflated, especially when it comes to the power. But if Tim Tower could come into spring training and crank some balls as we get ready for opening day, he might have a chance at making himself a name and cracking the opening day roster as a backup infielder for the Arizona Diamondbacks. Now I've got part 2 of players who have a lot to prove this spring training, and we'll discuss those guys in segment number 2.
From the first whistle to the final drive, FanDuel makes the NFL playoffs even more exciting. Right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $300 in bonus bets if you win your first bet. That's $300 to keep the action going. FanDuel is the app that is easy to navigate, and the variety of bets keeps every game exciting. Plus, when you win, you get paid instantly, no waiting around for your winnings. Whether you're betting on your favorite team or just looking to add some extra excitement to the playoffs, FanDuel has you covered. My favorite thing to do on FanDuel is the same game parlay. Whenever the Suns are playing, give me KD over on 25 points, give me Booker over on 25, and give me the Suns money line. When it hits, which is not very often, it brings a big smile to my face. If you want a big smile on your face, just visit FanDuel.com to join today and get started with $300 in bonus bets. That's FanDuel.com. Make this playoff season unforgettable with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL.
Back here on the Locked on Diamondbacks podcast. The setup still isn't the best right now. Still trying to figure out my podcast setup. So if you're like, why is it starting to look weird in the background? I'm kind of moving offices every day right now as I record the podcast. But eventually I will be back to a nice normal studio. Let's get back into our part 2 of guys who have a lot to prove this offseason, this spring training. Again, it's guys fighting for that opening day roster spot who are looking to crack, who are looking to really make an impact as a fringe guy in the rotation or the roster this season. And so we already discussed Drey Jameson, Seth Martinez, Yulbert Diaz, and Tim Tawa. The next guy I want to discuss is a little Tommy Henry, because I think we all forgot about Tommy Henry, and rightfully so. I don't think there was a lot to be remembered from him. He was pretty solid in 23. We're hoping he can improve on that in 24. He was terrible last season. I even think he got hurt and had to miss the rest of the season as well. But maybe I'm wrong about the injury thing, but Tommy Henry was just flat out bad last year when he did play. A 7.04 ERA. He made 7 starts, which was even more than Yulbert Diaz made, which I completely forgot about. He had 11.5 hits per 9 allowed, a 1.748 whip, 4.2 walks per 9. Like, he doesn't strike out people. He gives up a ton of walks. He gives up a lot of hits. And it's like, what does he really do that is beneficial and additive to the D-backs? That's why he's a lot to prove, because I'm out on Tommy Henry. I'm off the bandwagon. I think a lot of D-backs fans feel the same. That's why he's a lot to prove, because there's not a lot of people in the Tommy Henry corner right now, especially when you look at the current loaded D-backs rotation. Guys like Ryan Nelson, Brandon Pfaadt feel like they're on the ascension. Guys like Yulbert Diaz, even a Blake Walston flashed a little bit last season. Got guys like Drey Jameson coming back. And just like, there's so much more tantalizing pieces right now on the D-backs roster than a Tommy Henry. That's why he has to go out there and kind of be like the boring version of like Merrill Kelly, where Merrill Kelly wasn't exciting, but then all of a sudden he became exciting because he became consistently good. Merrill Kelly at first was boring, and then it was like, oh, he's going to give us 200 innings pitch and a 3.2 ERA for the course of a full season. Like, oh, okay, that guy's actually a legit number 2. I'm not saying Tommy Henry's going to be Merrill Kelly, but it's okay to be a boring guy who only tops out at 90 miles per hour if you're super effective and good at what you do. And so that's what Tommy Henry has to prove this spring training. Next, how about a little Kyle Nelson, because he is someone that kind of lost his spot last year. This is someone that was a go-to D-backs lefty in 2022 when he had a 2.19 ERA over 37 innings pitched, but not very good in 23, and then missed a bunch of time last year and also wasn't effective either. It feels like the D-backs are trending in the other direction with Kyle Nelson. 10.8 strikeouts per 9, 23, but fell all the way to 6.8 strikeouts per 9 in 24. And right now it feels like Kyle Nelson is on the outside looking in of those D-backs lefties that could be in the bullpen. You got Puck, you got Mantiply. Right now, Kyle Nelson does not feel like he has great footing with this D-backs organization. The fact that he at least has a track record of being with Arizona and a track record of some success, I think helps him. But if I was to do a power ranking, I don't feel great about the Kyle Nelson position right now, but I could be wrong about it. And of course, that's where spring training comes into account, because Kyle Nelson goes out there and just looks dominant, racking up the Ks. If the velocity is raised with Kyle Nelson, right? If he has worked on something this offseason that we did not see prior, that's what this spring training is all about. That's what camp is all about. Come show us what you've been working on. Give us the best shot of, everything you've been working on the last few months, because this is going to be your best opportunity to crack that opening day roster and maybe get some real playing time. Kyle Nelson has tasted real playing time with the D-backs before. And if he wants to get back to that, a good spring training goes a long way, at least for me. How about that catcher position? I actually think this is one of the big battles this spring training. The backup catcher, Jose Herrera versus Adrian Del Castillo. Herrera last year, he's like fine, negative WAR. Offensively, he doesn't do much. He has one career home run. Like, he really does nothing offensively. Defensively, he's like not even that good either. He's like average at best defensively. He's like, what does he really do? Great question. If we're not going to have at least an elite defensive backup catcher, then at least go with a great offensive backup catcher, because ADC might be terrible defensively, but at least offensively, you could talk yourself into him being the DH and maybe taking over that role from like Pavin Smith if Pavin Smith, doesn't get out to a hot start, or if he's really bad throughout this season. Because Del Castillo in 25 games last year, 80 at-bats, of course, small sample size, but 4 home runs, a 313 average, and an 893 OPS. I think all D-backs fans would much rather see Adrian Del Castillo than Jose Herrera as the backup to Moreno. Moreno is an elite defensive catcher who's probably going to play, if healthy, like 120, 130 games. Yes, those other 30 games or whatever might not get the best defense with Adrian Del Castillo, might cost you a run because of that defense, but he also might make it up with his big bat offensively, crushing a home run, a walk-off, might win you a game with his bat. Yes, he might give up a run because of his glove, but he might win you a game because of his bat. So I would take ADC over Jose Herrera in the battle for backup catcher. Then the final guy who I want to discuss, who seems pretty locked into a spot on the roster, but I think his playing time has to be up for grabs because he has yet to show us really anything offensively. Alek Thomas. Defensively, monster stud. It's been the reason he's been a plus WAR player, according to Baseball Reference, through his first 2 seasons. But last year, a 0 WAR player through 39 games. And again, offensively has yet to show anything in his career. 850 at-bats, 277 games. He got 226 average, a 629 OPS, and a 73 OPS plus. He has been one of the worst offensive players in the sport during that stretch, and his speed hasn't really even been a factor. He hasn't really been able to take advantage of his quickness at all, and right now the defense is the only thing keeping him in the league. If he was any worse of a defender than he currently is, I'm not sure he would be on the active roster, because offensively he really hasn't done anything. And I think the leash is getting a little bit shorter and shorter with Thomas, especially when considering Thomas was like ahead of Jake McCarthy in the depth chart entering last season. If it wasn't for Thomas getting hurt, we would not have maybe gotten that breakout out of Jake McCarthy. And it's like, how many more opportunities is Thomas potentially taking away from other guys due to the fact that he hasn't been able to hit? Like, is Jorge Barrosa just better than Thomas right now, but we're afraid to commit to him because of Thomas's defense and maybe his offensive potential? I'm not too sure. And so I think Thomas, the clock is starting to tick with him. We all love him. We remember that big home run in the NLCS against Craig Kimbrell. I talk about it at least once a week with my Phillies fan. Phillies fan friend, I have to rub it in his face at least once a week. But Thomas, he needs to get better offensively. Still super young, still only 24 years of age, which is crazy. If he ever puts it together with his bat, he has the potential to be one of the best outfielders in the sport. But as it currently stands, Thomas is probably, unfortunately, more of a liability than not because of his offensive struggles. And so we're all rooting for Thomas, and we're praying he can finally have that breakout offensive season. Now we're going to discuss some stats, good or bad, that we don't think the D-backs can replicate in 2025. We'll discuss that in segment number 3. And if you're looking to buy tickets to an upcoming sport or an event, then the best place to do that, of course, is going to be Game Times, because Game Time is the best place for last minute deals on sports, concerts, comedy, theater, and more. They have this feature called all-in pricing. When you toggle this feature on, it shows you your total cost
up front with no surprise fees at checkout. You could get a panoramic view from your seat before you buy. They also have the lowest price guarantee, or Game Time will credit you 110% of the difference. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off. Download Game Time today. What time is it? Game time.
All right, back here on the Locked on Diamondbacks podcast, and let's discuss some stats, good or bad, that we don't think the D-backs are going to replicate in 2025. And the first one I want to discuss is both a good and bad stat that has to do with the runners in scoring position, because last year we know D-backs had the best offense, led the league in runs and average and yada yada. And a big way to lead the league in runs scored is to come through in the clutch. And that's what the D-backs did better than any team last year, because they were number one with runners in scoring position with a 852 OPS last year, number one in runs scored. Like, they were dominant offensively. They were clutch. You go up and down the roster from Marte to guys like Gabriel Moreno. We know Perdomo. Like, it doesn't matter who you look at. Jake McCarthy, Grichuk, Jock Peterson, they were all studs. But a reason why it's going to come down a little bit is because of regression to the mean, and just one of those stats you can't replicate year after year. And guys like Jock Peterson leaving, of course, is going to hurt. Guys like Christian Walker leaving, of course, is going to hurt. And so you just can't replicate being the best team by far, like by 50 points in OPS. The D-backs were better than the number two team with the runners in scoring position. So offensively, that's going to come down. But on the vice versa side, D-backs pitchers, 787 OPS was the second worst allowed in the sport, or at least in the National League as well. And so if you're looking at it, yes, the D-backs offense is going to come down the clutch, but the pitchers should be way better with the new additions, with the health hopefully improving. That should be way better. So just in general, the runners in scoring position stat is one where it's going to fluctuate year to year. And when you're on the variance that the D-backs were on last year, where your offense is the best in baseball by far at runners in scoring position, then your pitchers are arguably the worst in the sport. On the other side of the spectrum, that variance is just too crazy, and we should see the D-backs meet a lot more in the middle next year. And I think it would end up being beneficial for the D-backs for their win-loss column positively if that thing probably ends up being a little bit more balanced next year. Next that I want to discuss is D-backs probably won't lead the league in home runs next year. Maybe that's a crazy take, but considering Christian Walker is gone with his 26 home runs, we got Jock Peterson gone as well with his 23 home runs. Now, we did bring back Grichuk. Maybe he taps into some more pop. A guy like Josh Naylor, of course, he had 31 home runs last year. That's more than what Christian Walker had. But I just find it hard to believe the D-backs are once again going to lead the league in home runs. And maybe I could be wrong, because maybe a guy like Corbin Carroll is back to near 30. Maybe a guy like Lord Gurriel is back to near 25. Then everyone else does what they did last year. Then the D-backs could be right back to leading the league in home runs. But this is not a team that typically does that. This is a team built more on speed, more on chaos, more on the small ball. And so if they do replicate the league in home runs again, I would be very surprised. But I would like to think that number is going to come down with the guys like Josh Bell, Jock Peterson, Christian Walker, like some real thumpers in the lineup leaving. Yes, we got Josh Naylor coming back, but I feel like there's more thumpers leaving than coming back in the lineup right now. But I would very happy to be wrong on that stat. D-backs, second worst OPS against runners, second worst OPS allowed against right-handed batters last year. I think this one is really weird, because this D-backs team is built with a really strong right-handed pitching. And so I think last year was just kind of fluky, third worst against right-handed batters in terms of OPS. We have Corbin Burns now, a healthy season from Gallen Kelly, a year of development from Brandon Pfaadt. Like, those are 4 really good right-handed pitchers in the rotation. A full season of Justin Martinez. Ginkel doesn't have to be the closer. He can just be in his natural role as the setup man all year. I think in terms of D-backs mowing down right-handed batters next year, they were bad in 24, but I think in 25, they could be like a top 5 team, not just in the NL, but maybe in Major League Baseball with how their rotation and bullpen is currently constructed. So I definitely think that's a stat that's not going to replicate for the D-backs. Another one pertaining to the pitching, D-backs were 3rd worst in OPS and strikeouts from innings 7 to 9 last year. And I just don't think that's going to happen again, because you're going to get a full season of both AJ Puck, Justin Martinez, and Kevin Ginkel as your 7th inning guy. And even potentially, D-backs could still go out there and get a good reliever and maybe a David Robertson or someone else that's available that has closer experience or a really good back end reliever. Like, there's still a ton of options out there. And so if you're telling me I get a full season of Martinez being the closer, throwing hard, mowing down guys with 6-7, AJ Puck coming in the 8th inning, then potential free agent reliever X or Kevin Ginkel as my 7th inning guy. Still got Ryan Thompson in the mix. Still got Joe Mantiply in the mix. And maybe one of these youngsters like a Yulber Diaz or like a Drey Jameson. I think the D-backs 7 to 9 just going to be way better going to next season, because we just trimmed some of the fat around the edges with the Paul Sewalds getting out of here. Like, no more of him trying to close out games for the D-backs. It was terrible. No more Scott McGuffs. We had Logan Allen, Brandon Hughes. Like, all these guys finished games for the D-backs at some point last year, and just no more of that. D-backs trimming some of the fat should help out this roster a lot going to next year. So I think the D-backs back in the bullpen should be way better than what it was in 2024. Now, that's it for this edition of the Locked on Diamondbacks podcast. Come back tomorrow for more Diamondbacks news coverage and insight as pitchers and catchers report for spring training. And as always, stay safe, stay healthy. Dose it.